A global superhero strapped to a psychiatric bed, a beloved child actor grinding on a sticky nightclub pole, and a pop prince suffocating in a flooded bathtub. Hollywood built a billion-dollar empire on their innocent smiles. But the exact second these boys stepped outside their manufactured straight identities, the machine didn't just fire them. It starved them, broke their minds, and systematically drove them to the grave. This is the shattered rainbow, the brutal, untold execution of the industry's brightest child stars who dared to be themselves. We have seen this machine use drugs to destroy Brad Renfro, and we've watched it financially cannibalize Macaulay Culkin. But the industry possesses a weapon far more silent and far more lethal. It's sexual hypocrisy. The sheer scale of the psychological violence inflicted upon David Yost was deeply rooted in the daily environment of the production. The set of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers in the early 1990s was not a playground, it was a sweatshop. The franchise was a global phenomenon, raking in billions in merchandising, broadcasting, syndication, and movie rights. Yet, the actors wearing the helmets were entirely unprotected. They were hired on non-union contracts. There was no Screen Actors Guild representation to monitor their hours, their safety, or their pay. The actors were paid slightly more than minimum wage, often cited as roughly $600 a week during the peak of their global fame. They worked 15-hour days in unair-conditioned warehouses in the blistering Southern California heat. They performed highly dangerous stunts themselves because the production refused to pay for professional stunt doubles for every shot. They routinely suffered dislocated shoulders, torn ligaments, and severe exhaustion. But the physical bruising was merely the baseline of their exploitation. For David Yost, the physical exhaustion was compounded by a calculated, relentless campaign of mental abuse, orchestrated by the very people, who signed his checks. David was a closeted gay man living in an era where the entertainment industry still viewed homosexuality not just as a taboo, but as a financial liability. The creators and crew members on the set did not need an official coming out announcement. They observed him, they profiled him, and once they decided he did not fit the hypermasculine mold of a 1990s action hero, they initiated a process of systematic dehumanization. The abuse was not subtle, it was woven into the daily fabric of the production. Directors, producers, and crew members casually and repeatedly used the word faggot in David's presence. It was thrown across the soundstage. It was muttered near the craft services table. It was spoken over the headsets. The intention was clear: to establish a hierarchy where David was placed at the absolute bottom, stripped of his dignity despite being a core component of a billion-dollar brand. But the cruelty escalated beyond verbal slurs. The production team weaponized David's sexuality to isolate him from his peers. The producers began calling the other cast members, the actors playing the Red, Black, and Green Rangers, into private, closed-door meetings. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the production offices, they interrogated David's co-stars. They asked pointed, invasive questions. Had David looked at them in the locker room? Had he brushed past them too closely during fight choreography? Had he made them uncomfortable? This was a deliberate tactic of quarantine. The producers were planting the seed that David was a predator. They were constructing a narrative that his presence was a contamination. By questioning the other actors, the production staff effectively turned the cast into a surveillance network, making David radioactive on his own set. The human body reacts to prolonged psychological terror with physical symptoms. The paranoia clamped down on David's nervous system. He could no longer eat with the crew. During lunch, Kiss. Instead of sitting at the communal tables, David would take his food and lock himself inside his car. He sat in the baking heat of the parking lot, eating in absolute silence, terrified that a simple glance at a male coworker would be misinterpreted, reported, and used as ammunition to fire him. The blue spandex suit he wore for the cameras became a suffocating second skin. His hands developed severe tremors. He was a global symbol of teamwork, intellect, and courage, but in reality, he was a man being hunted inside a soundstage. The snapping point arrived in the summer of 1996. After 4 seasons of relentless psychological warfare, the wire finally broke. During a routine lunch break, after enduring yet another targeted slur from the production staff, David Yost did not retaliate. He did not yell. He simply walked into his dressing room. He peeled off the Blue Ranger uniform, left it crumpled on a chair, packed a small bag, and walked out to his car. He drove away from the studio lot. The panic attack was so severe, he had to pull his car onto the shoulder of the highway, blinded by his own hyperventilation. He never returned to the set. However, leaving the show did not stop the bleeding. Hollywood had spent 4 years drilling a toxic narrative into his brain, that his natural identity was a disease, a defect that disqualified him from humanity and success. Unemployed, traumatized, and desperate to fix himself so he could work in the industry again, David made a decision that would nearly end his life. He voluntarily checked himself into a conversion therapy program. In the 1990s, the concept of conversion therapy was still quietly endorsed by various conservative and institutional factions across America. It operated under the guise of psychological or spiritual healing, but the methodology was pure psychological torture. David surrendered himself to this system. For 2 agonizing years, he submitted to a regimen designed to completely dismantle his ego, and erase his sexual orientation. He was placed in sterile rooms and subjected to aversion therapy. Program leaders forced him to his knees on hard floors, commanding him to pray loudly for hours, to exorcise his demons, continuing until his vocal cords were raw. He was instructed to write down every homosexual thought or attraction he experienced, read the list aloud to a room full of strangers, and then endure their structured, intense verbal degradation. The goal of conversion therapy is to induce intense shame and physical revulsion toward one's own nature. The therapist meticulously attacked his core identity, telling him that his desires were filthy, that he was an abomination, and that his inability to change was a moral failure. They demanded that he rewire his brain through sheer force of trauma. A human nervous system cannot sustain that level of internal conflict without collapsing. You cannot neurologically amputate a core component of a person's identity. The harder David tried to become a heterosexual man to satisfy the arbitrary moral standards of the society that discarded him, the more his sanity fractured. After 2 years of relentless mental conditioning, the conversion therapy did not cure his homosexuality. It triggered a catastrophic nervous breakdown. The physical symptoms of the breakdown were violent. David lost the ability to sleep. His heart rate remained elevated in a constant state of fight or flight panic. The depression deepened into chronic, deafening, suicidal ideation. His brain, exhausted from the continuous loop of self-hatred and cognitive dissonance, simply shut down to protect itself. He lost his grip on reality. He could no longer speak coherently or remember basic details about his life. Recognizing that he was days, if not hours, away from taking his own life, Friends intervened and transported him to a psychiatric hospital in Mexico. For 5 weeks, the man who was once the idol of millions of children was locked inside a white room. He was heavily medicated, lying on a thin hospital mattress, staring blankly at the walls. He was stripped of his career, stripped of his savings, and completely stripped of his identity. The Hollywood machine that had profited from his face continued to syndicate his episodes globally, generating millions in ad revenue, entirely indifferent to the fact that the actor in the blue helmet had been driven to the absolute edge of human endurance by their own executives. The studio extracted his capital and discarded him once he was no longer profitable. While David Yost was chemically sedated in a windowless Mexican psychiatric ward, staring at ceiling tiles to escape the ghosts of a television soundstage, another childhood icon was being silently, methodically starved to death by the exact same machine. To the millions of children sitting cross-legged in front of glowing television sets in 1994, Blake McIver Ewing was a fixture of the American living room. He was the wealthy, nasal-voiced, bow-tie-wearing Waldo in the blockbuster film The Little Rascals. He was the cheeky, fast-talking Derek on the ratings juggernaut Full House. He was a golden child. With his oversized glasses and perfectly combed hair, he was a highly engineered, mass-marketed product. The studios packaged his prepubescent innocence, slapped a barcode on his forehead, and used his face to vacuum millions of dollars from the wallets of parents worldwide. To the executives at ABC and Universal, Blake was not a boy. He was a yield-bearing asset. They protected the asset. They chauffeured the asset to premieres. They fed the asset lines. They made sure the asset smiled on cue. But Hollywood operates on a biological ticking clock. The industry loves child stars, but it absolutely despises teenagers who fail to morph into the precise, highly lucrative molds required for adult leading roles. When a child actor hits puberty, the contract is quietly rewritten. You are no longer allowed to be cute. You must become a commodity of sexual desire. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Hollywood machine accepted only one brand of male desire: aggressive, unfiltered, and strictly heterosexual. When Blake McIver Ewing grew up and stopped hiding his attraction to men, he crossed an invisible tripwire. He stepped out of the acceptable, profitable box they had built for him, and the machine did not hesitate to activate its defense mechanisms. The punishment for an LGBT child star in this era was rarely a public firing. The industry is far too cowardly for loud confrontations. Instead, they employ a weapon that is completely silent, untraceable, and utterly lethal: the blacklist. The destruction of Blake's career did not happen in a single dramatic boardroom meeting. It happened in the freezing, fluorescent-lit waiting rooms of Los Angeles casting offices. Blake, possessing a flawless resume and a face recognized by half the country, would walk into auditions. He knew his lines. He hit his marks. He possessed undeniable, veteran-level comedic timing. He would deliver a perfect read. But behind the folding tables, the casting directors and producers would share a fleeting, silent glance. They would look at the way he stood. They would listen to the cadence of his voice. They would cross his name off their clipboards before his hand even touched the doorknob to leave. The feedback funneled through his agents was entirely coded, stripped of any actionable criticism. He's just not edgy enough. He lacks leading man energy. He's a bit too soft for the demographic. We just don't think teenage girls will pin his poster on their walls. This was not artistic direction. This was a surgical execution. The executives who publicly championed diversity at glittering charity galas were the exact same people looking at a former child star and deciding that his homosexuality made him completely unsellable. They determined that a gay man could not believably romance a woman on screen, and because gay leading roles did not exist in mainstream studio projects, Blake was classified as obsolete machinery. The industry did not just reject him, they effectively deleted him. The psychological toll of a silent boycott is a specific kind of torture. If you are fired, you have closure. If you are blacklisted without confirmation, you begin to cannibalize your own sanity. Blake spent years driving across the blistering concrete grid of Los Angeles, burning through his savings to attend auditions for roles he was statistically barred from winning. He watched actors with half his experience and a fraction of his talent walk onto sets because they fit the rigid heterosexual jawline requirements of the network executives. Then came the financial hemorrhage. The general public operates under the delusion that child stars are set for life. They believe the millions generated by the films sit securely in bank vaults, waiting for their 18th birthdays. The reality is often a barren wasteland of mismanaged trust funds, predatory taxation, and the staggering cost of living in Los Angeles while attempting to maintain the facade of a working actor. Blake was stripped of his only trade. He had spent his entire childhood on active film sets. He did not have a normal high school experience. He was not taught how to navigate the corporate job market, how to write a standard resume, or how to survive without a production coordinator handing him a daily schedule. Hollywood bred him to be a performer and then permanently locked the doors to the only stage he knew. The evaporation of his finances was rapid and brutal. The residual checks from Full House and The Little Rascals slowed to a trickle. The savings accounts drained. The red ink on his bank statements bled into the eviction notices piling up on his kitchen counter. The boy who once generated millions of dollars in box office revenue was now staring at his ceiling in the dark, calculating how many days of electricity he had left before the city cut the power. He was standing on the absolute edge of homelessness. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately, untaxed and in hand. Pushed to the brink of starvation, Blake McIver Ewing made a decision that violently fractured the pristine, family-friendly image Hollywood had constructed for him. He walked out of his apartment, drove to the neon-soaked underbelly of West Hollywood, and walked through the back door of a gay nightclub. He did not go there to drink. He went there to sell the only asset the industry had not yet managed to completely destroy: his physical body. The transition from a child television icon to a nightclub go-go dancer is a psychological whiplash that defies comprehension. The environment was an assault on the senses. The air inside the club was thick with humidity, the smell of cheap vodka, stale sweat, and poppers. The bass from the speakers shook the sticky, alcohol-stained floorboards. In a cramped, filthy dressing room in the back of the club, Blake stripped off his clothes. He pulled on a tiny, skin-tight thong. He looked into a cracked mirror surrounded by burnt-out, incandescent bulbs. The face looking back at him was the exact same face that had smiled politely next to Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen on the set of Full House. Now, it was the face of a man preparing to sell his dignity to keep a roof over his head. He pushed through the heavy velvet curtains and stepped out onto a small, elevated wooden box positioned above the crowd. The blinding strobe lights hit his bare skin. The music hammered against his eardrums. Blake forced a smile, locked his jaw, and began to move. He ground his hips against a cold brass pole. He flexed his muscles, sweating under the heavy, predatory gaze of hundreds of intoxicated men. Strangers reached up from the darkness, their hands grazing his bare thighs, shoving crumpled, damp $1 and $5 bills into the thin elastic waistband of his underwear. This was the ultimate grotesque paradox of the Hollywood machine. In order to survive the financial ruin inflicted upon him by the entertainment industry's homophobia, he had to physically commodify himself in the exact spaces the industry deemed too dirty to acknowledge. There were nights when the dissociation was the only thing keeping him from collapsing on the stage. He would bend over, his skin slick with sweat, to peel a sticky dollar bill off the floor, and he could look up over the crowd to see a muted television monitor hanging above the club's bar. Broadcasting on the screen, in syndication, was a rerun of his childhood. There he was, a bright-eyed, innocent boy in a bow tie, making millions of American families laugh. And here he was, breathing heavily in a thong, dancing for table scraps. The visual shock of this reality is the most damning indictment of the studio system. They did not just abandon him, they created the exact conditions that forced him onto that podium. They harvested his youth, banked the profits, and then weaponized their own moral hypocrisy to starve him out. They dictated that a gay man was not worthy of standing on a soundstage, but they were perfectly content to let him grind on a nightclub floor just to buy groceries. Blake McIver Ewing did not fail Hollywood. Hollywood executed him. They stripped him of his craft, backed him into a corner of utter poverty, and watched as he was forced to trade the red carpet for a sticky stage. The industry's exploitation extended beyond careers and dignity, culminating in fatal physical consequences within the pop music sector. At 10 years old, a child's central nervous system is still developing. It is not designed to process the deafening, predatory roar of 70,000 screaming strangers. It is not designed to withstand the blinding, searing heat of industrial stage pyrotechnics erupting 3 feet away. And it is certainly not designed to bear the financial weight of an entire Adderley T family's real estate portfolio. But Aaron Carter was not treated as a child. He was treated as a human ATM. The absolute crushing isolation that eventually drove Aaron into a cold bathtub began the exact moment his humanity was replaced with a barcode. Backstage at a sold-out stadium tour in the early 2000s, the air was thick with the smell of hairspray, sweat, and burning electrical cables. Aaron, barely a teenager, would come sprinting off the stage, his chest heaving violently, gasping for oxygen in the humid, windowless corridors of the arena. His blonde hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. His vocal cords were raw and bleeding from forcing high notes night after night. He would bend over a plastic trash can, dry heaving from sheer physical exhaustion, his small frame shaking uncontrollably under the heavy sequined jackets the wardrobe department forced him to wear. His parents did not rush over with cold compresses. They did not pull him into a hug. They did not tell him to rest. They stood in the wings holding clipboards and cellular phones, calculating the gross profit margins of the foam glow sticks and oversized t-shirts being sold in the venue's lobby. They looked at their gasping, trembling son, and all they saw was a highly efficient, blonde-haired printing press. The moment Aaron stopped vomiting, a handler would shove a microphone back into his sweaty palm, point him toward the blinding stadium lights, and push him back into the arena. "Smile," they told him. "Keep them screaming." For years, Aaron lived in this state of perpetual, high-functioning physical trauma. He was denied a childhood, denied a normal education, and denied the basic human right of unconditional love. The affection he received from his family was strictly transactional. It was directly tied to his ability to sell out venues, top the Billboard charts, and keep the massive influx of cash flowing into their bank accounts. He was a hostage in plain sight, paraded across television screens globally, smiling with perfect white teeth while his internal reality was a dark, suffocating prison of labor exploitation. The general public looked at Aaron Carter and saw a prince living in a platinum castle. They assumed that the tens of millions of dollars he generated were being safely locked away in heavily guarded trust funds, quietly accumulating interest until his 18th birthday. The reality was a financial slaughterhouse. When the stadium lights finally shut off, when the teenage demographic aged out of his music, and the heavy touring schedules ground to a halt, the illusion of the Carter empire evaporated overnight. Aaron crossed the threshold into adulthood, walked into his accountant's office, and asked to see the keys to his kingdom. There was no kingdom. The vault was empty. The physical sensation of extreme financial panic is paralyzing. It starts as a cold numbness in the fingers and rapidly spreads to the chest, tightening the lungs until breathing feels like swallowing glass. Sitting in that sterile, fluorescent-lit office, Aaron stared at the stacks of paper pushed across the desk. The numbers printed in heavy black ink did not show millions in savings. They showed catastrophic, bleeding red ink. His parents had not protected his earnings. They had funneled the money into their own lifestyles, mismanaged his assets to a criminal degree, and neglected to pay the government. Aaron did not inherit a fortune. He inherited a multi-million-dollar tax lien from the IRS. The people who had wiped his tears when he was an infant, the people who were supposed to be the ultimate safety net, had quietly, methodically drained his lifeblood. They had cannibalized his youth and left him holding the bag. At 25 years old, the boy who had sold tens of millions of records and generated impossible wealth had to walk into a federal courthouse and legally declare himself bankrupt. He was completely, utterly destitute. The betrayal of a blood is the deepest wound a human being can sustain. Aaron realized in that moment that he was entirely alone in the world. He had no money, no career momentum, and no family that viewed him as anything more than a dried-up well. His nervous system, already battered by years of extreme childhood stress, began to aggressively fray. But the machine was not done punishing him. Hollywood and the public are addicted to the rise of a child star, but they are equally obsessed with tearing them down. Aaron became a punchline. The tabloids published photos of his gaunt frame and mocked his financial ruin. They laughed at the former pop prince who now couldn't afford his own groceries. Desperate for a lifeline, desperate to shed the suffocating manufactured image that had been forced upon him since he was 10 years old, Aaron decided to strip away the final layer of the Hollywood illusion. He decided to tell the truth. In August of 2017, inside the suffocating silence of his bedroom, illuminated only by the harsh blue glare of his smartphone screen, Aaron began to type. He wrote about his years of internal struggle. He wrote about the heavy, suffocating weight of hiding his true identity in an industry that demands strict adherence to traditional marketable masculinity. He pressed the button, sending a message out to millions of followers, publicly coming out as bisexual. In a just world, or even a mildly empathetic one, this moment of extreme vulnerability would have been met with a shield of support. Aaron was drowning, and he had fired a flare gun into the pitch-black sky, begging for someone to see him as a human being, not just a broken product. Instead of throwing him a life preserver, the world threw stones. The backlash was immediate, visceral, and unspeakably cruel. The notifications flooding his phone were not messages of solidarity. They were digital poison. Strangers hid behind anonymous keyboards, ripping his confession to shreds. They accused him of lying. They called him a washed-up attention seeker, fabricating a fake sexuality just to get his name back in the tabloid headlines. The public completely invalidated his reality. But the absolute final strike, the knife twist that severed Aaron's last remaining tether to sanity, came from his own blood. When a person comes out and is met with global hostility, the only shelter they have left is their family. Aaron needed his older brother. He needed Nick Carter, the massively successful clean-cut member of the Backstreet Boys. He needed the brother who had shared the same stages, who understood the crushing pressure of the industry to quietly pull up to his driveway, lock the doors, and tell him he was safe. Nick Carter did not come to the house. He did not make a private, off-the-record phone call. Instead, Nick prioritized his own highly lucrative, sanitized public image over the life of his spiraling, desperate, younger brother. Sensing that Aaron's erratic behavior and public vulnerability were becoming a PR liability, Nick and his sister took the dispute out of the living room and dragged it directly into the flashing cameras of the paparazzi. They weaponized the legal system against him. They filed for public restraining orders. The execution was broadcast globally. The news cycles were dominated by the headlines, "Backstreet Boy Nick Carter files restraining order against brother Aaron." Nick took to Twitter, a platform with millions of eyes, to publicly state that he feared for his family's safety, essentially branding Aaron as a violent, unhinged threat to the world. There was no private intervention. There was no attempt at quiet medical rehabilitation. It was a loud, highly publicized excommunication. The physical reality of Aaron's existence in that moment was bleak. He is sitting alone in his house. The television is playing the news of his own brother filing legal documents to keep him away. His phone is vibrating endlessly with thousands of messages from Steve. Anger's telling him his sexuality is a joke and his life is worthless. He looks at his bank account and the numbers are zeros. He looks at his family tree and the branches have been sawed off. Every single institution that was supposed to protect him, the studio system, the management, the fan base, and his own biological parents and siblings, had systematically extracted his value, rejected his true identity, and locked the doors, leaving him entirely alone in the dark. When pushed into inescapable psychological isolation, the brain cannot process the pain and demands a chemical override to shut down the receptors. Aaron Carter, trapped in a house that felt like a tomb, began looking for anything that could turn the lights out in his head. For Hollywood's elite, this usually meant checking into a discreet luxury rehabilitation center in Malibu, or using high-end designer narcotics behind the velvet ropes of exclusive clubs. Aaron Carter did not have access to luxury. Stripped of his fortune, abandoned by his bloodline, and publicly crucified for his bisexuality, his descent was not glamorous. It was a gritty, terrifying plunge into the cheapest, most corrosive form of chemical lobotomy available in suburban America. He didn't turn to imported cocaine or prescription painkillers in a VIP lounge. He resorted to purchasing cans of compressed air from a local office supply store, engaging in a highly destructive form of inhalant abuse. It is a brutal, violent assault on the human anatomy. Inside the sprawling, eerily quiet rooms of his house, in Lancaster, California. The only sound that broke the suffocating silence was the sharp, mechanical hiss of the aerosol nozzle. Aaron would sit alone on the floor of his bathroom, lock his teeth around the thin red plastic straw of the duster can, and press the trigger. The chemical inside, difluoroethane, was not designed for human consumption. It is an industrial refrigerant. When inhaled directly, it drops below freezing temps, temperatures instantly, burning the lips and throat with chemical frostbite. It does not produce a euphoric, dreamlike high. Instead, it violently displaces the oxygen in the lungs. It races into the bloodstream and slams into the central nervous system like a sledgehammer. For a few fleeting, terrifying minutes, the brain is quite literally suffocated. The room spins. The vision tunnels into absolute blackness. The auditory hallucinations kick in, a deafening metallic ringing in the ears that drowns out the silence of the empty house. And most importantly, for those 3 minutes of oxygen starvation, Aaron could not remember the face of his brother on the television screen. He could not remember the millions of dollars stolen from him. He could not remember the internet mobs mocking his sexuality. He was completely, blessedly paralyzed. But the toll this chemical exacts on the physical body is catastrophic. It dissolves the myelin sheath around the nerves. It rots the brain tissue. The physical metamorphosis of Aaron Carter was a slow public horror movie. The boy who had once smiled from the covers of teen magazines with perfectly styled blonde hair and glowing skin was decomposing in front of the world. His weight plummeted violently. His cheekbones jutted out against pale, translucent skin. His teeth began to decay from the chemical burns and neglect. Unable to bear the reflection of his own deterioration in the bathroom mirror, Aaron made a desperate, chaotic attempt to reclaim his physical form. He began covering his face and neck in dark, erratic tattoos. He inked massive, aggressive designs directly onto his jawline, his throat, his cheeks. He tattooed the name of his estranged girlfriend over his eyebrow. The ink was not art, it was camouflage. It was a frantic attempt to distract the eye from the hollow, haunted emptiness sinking into his eye sockets. He was trying to look intimidating, trying to project a hardened, untouchable exterior, while internally, his organs were shutting down. But the most terrifying aspect of Aaron's final months was not the chemical abuse itself. It was the fact that he broadcast the entire descent live to millions of strangers. Trapped in a house that felt increasingly like a tomb, paralyzed by paranoia, Aaron turned to his smartphone. He set up his camera in his living room, his bedroom, his garage, and went live on Instagram and TikTok for hours, sometimes days, at a time. The digital panopticon he created was deeply disturbing. The fans who tuned in did not see a pop star. They saw a man pacing frantically around a messy, poorly lit room, holding a loaded assault rifle, checking the windows for imaginary assassins. They watched him slur his words, his eyes rolling back into his head as the anti-anxiety medication, Xanax, mixed lethally with the inhalants off camera. He would scream at the lens, crying hysterically 1 minute and threatening invisible enemies the next. He would play his old multi-platinum hit songs on massive speakers in the background, desperately trying to prove to the anonymous usernames scrolling up the screen that he still mattered, that he was still the boy they used to love. The response from the digital crowd was the ultimate manifestation of the industry's cruelty. The thousands of people watching the live stream did not call for an ambulance. They did not log off. They stayed to watch the car crash. They threw digital coins and typed mocking comments. egging him on, treating his psychiatric collapse as a piece of free, late-night entertainment. Hollywood had conditioned the public to view child stars as disposable commodities, and the audience was simply consuming the final, rotting scraps of the product. His house became a physical manifestation of his decaying mind. The once expensive furniture was covered in cigarette ash and discarded clothes. The blinds were drawn tight, blocking out the California sun, plunging the rooms into a permanent, artificial twilight. And scattered across the expensive tile floors, rolling under the sofas and clattering against the baseboards, were the empty cans. Dozens and dozens of small metallic cylinders, the discarded shells of his only remaining coping mechanism. The isolation was now absolute. The security gates at the end of his driveway were locked. The family had legally barred themselves from his presence. The industry had erased his name from their contact lists. The only interaction he had with the outside world was through the glowing cold screen of a cell phone, reading the cruel insults of strangers while his lungs gasped for air that he was intentionally poisoning. He was entirely sealed inside the glass box. There was no one left to knock on the door. The machine had successfully backed him into the darkest, coldest corner of the room, handed him the poison, and simply waited for him to finish the job. The final 48 hours of Aaron Carter's life were not a sudden dramatic climax. They were a slow, suffocating bleed in total isolation. By the first week of November 2022, the sprawling house in Lancaster, California, had ceased to function as a home. It had become a barricaded bunker. The heavy blackout curtains were permanently drawn, blocking out the bright desert sun and locking the rooms in a stale, artificial dusk. The air conditioning hummed continuously, circulating the smell of unwashed clothes, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp chemical odor of difluorothane. There were no managers calling to check his schedule. There were no family members knocking on the front door to stage an intervention. The legal restraining orders were firmly in place. The industry had completely severed the phone lines. Aaron was alone with a pack of rescue dogs and a housekeeper, barricaded inside his master bedroom. He was self-medicating the profound terror of his abandonment with a lethal cocktail. On his nightstand, sitting under the harsh glow of a television monitor, lay orange prescription bottles filled with alprazolam, generic Xanax. It is a central nervous system depressant designed to slow the brain's activity, to artificially lower the panic. But the pills were not enough to mute the paranoia. For the immediate, violent blackout he craved, he relied on the cans of compressed air. On the evening of November 4th, the house went completely silent. Aaron did not log on to Instagram. He did not set up his ring light to broadcast his erratic pacing to the digital crowds. The erratic, frantic energy that had defined his public collapse simply stopped. He walked into his master bathroom. He turned the metal handles of the massive, oversized soaking tub. The water poured out, echoing loudly against the expensive ceramic tiles. He did not take off his clothes to bathe. He kept his clothes on. He climbed over the porcelain edge and sat down in the rising water. He brought the pills in the aerosol cans with him. Stripping away the celebrity reveals the cold, clinical reality of his death. The human body cannot process the simultaneous combination of heavy sedatives and industrial refrigerants. When Aaron swallowed the Xanax, his heart rate plummeted. His breathing slowed to a shallow crawl. The muscles in his neck and limbs became heavy and unresponsive. Then, sitting in the warm water, he placed the plastic nozzle of the duster can between his lips and inhaled. The difluorothane gas shot down his trachea. violently freezing the tissue and instantly replacing the oxygen in his lungs. The chemical rushed into his bloodstream and hit his heavily sedated brain. The combination was catastrophic. The Xanax had already disabled his body's natural fight-or-flight reflexes. When the compressed air starved his brain of oxygen, he did not panic. He did not thrash. He simply lost consciousness. The heavy, tattooed body of the former teenage idol slumped backward. He slid down the smooth porcelain slope of the bathtub. The water, still rising from the faucet, swallowed him completely. Because his central nervous system was chemically paralyzed, the instinctual human reflex to cough, to fight for the surface, to gasp for air, never triggered. The water filled his nose. It poured down his throat. It flooded his lungs. He drowned in absolute silence. The next morning, November 5th, 2022, the sun rose over the California desert, baking the roof of the Lancaster house. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic, continuous barking of Aaron's dogs, scratching at the locked master bedroom door. The housekeeper, arriving for her shift, noticed the unnatural quiet. She knocked on the bedroom door. There was no answer. She yelled his name through the wood. Nothing. Panic setting in, she found a way to force the door open. She stepped into the master suite. The bed was empty. She followed the sound of the dogs whining toward the locked bathroom door. She knocked again. The silence on the other side was heavy. She broke the bathroom door open. The scene was not a Hollywood movie set. It was a sterile, wet crime scene. The air in the bathroom was thick with humidity. The water in the bathtub had been running for hours, overflowing the porcelain edges, soaking the expensive bath mats, and pooling on the tile floor. Submerged entirely under the cold, stagnant water was Aaron. His skin, covered in dark, aggressive ink, had turned a pale, unnatural gray. The water distorted his features. Floating on the surface of the water and scattered across the wet floor tiles like discarded bullet casings were multiple green and white cans of compressed air. The orange prescription pill bottle sat empty on the counter. The housekeeper began screaming. She pulled her phone out with shaking hands and dialed 911, her voice completely hysterical, begging the dispatcher to send help, sobbing that the boy in the tub was dead. But there was no resuscitation. The paramedics arrived, waded through the flooded bathroom, and pulled Ed, the cold, stiff body, out of the water. He was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 34 years old. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in the grotesque nature of modern celebrity consumption. Before the coroner's van even arrived to wheel the black body bag out the front door, the paparazzi had already intercepted the police scanners. Within minutes, news helicopters were chopping through the air, hovering directly over the Lancaster house. Drones were deployed, buzzing like metallic insects over the roof, trying to capture a glimpse of the corpse through the bathroom skylight. The boy who had been abandoned by the industry was suddenly, violently relevant again because his death was profitable content. And then came the final blood-chilling insult. The family that had publicly humiliated him, the brother who had filed restraining orders and refused to take his calls, suddenly appeared on social media. Nick Carter drafted a highly polished, perfectly punctuated statement for his millions of followers. He posted throwback photos of them as smiling children. He wrote about his broken heart. He wrote that addiction and mental illness are the real villains here. He performed his grief perfectly for the digital audience, hitting all the right PR notes, sanitizing the narrative to completely erase the fact that Aaron had died completely isolated by the very people now harvesting likes off his corpse. The coroner's office wheeled Aaron Carter into a cold steel examination room. The autopsy report was released months later. It was devoid of emotion. It did not mention the sold-out stadiums. It did not mention the platinum records. It consisted of cold, hard toxicology facts. Cause of death, drowning, contributing factors, effects of defluorothane and alprazolam, manner of death, accidental. They drained the fluids, stitched the Y incision closed, and filed the paperwork. The Hollywood machine wiped the blood off its hands, updated the Wikipedia page TZT, reflect the date of death, and moved on. The Prince of Pop had been successfully processed, consumed, and discarded. Yet, Aaron Carter was merely the final victim in this specific, horrifying timeline. The boy who drowned in the bathtub, the boy who danced in his underwear on the sticky nightclub floor, and the boy who was psychologically tortured into a Mexican psychiatric ward. They were all casualties of the exact same lie. The crime scene tape is pulled down. The biohazard crews arrive in their sterile white Tyvek suits, carrying heavy-duty industrial trash bags. They walk into the flooded Lancaster bathroom, wipe the stagnant water off the expensive tiles, scoop up the empty aerosol cans, and scrub the bathtub with bleach until the porcelain is bone white again. The coroner files the paperwork into a metal cabinet. The real estate agents hire a staging company, bring in fresh flowers, and put the sprawling house back on the market. Within a matter of days, all physical evidence that Aaron Carter lived, suffered, and died in that room is completely erased. This is the final, most terrifying function of the Hollywood machine, the cleanup. The industry does not mourn its casualties. It merely sterilizes the crime scene and resets the stage. The destruction of David Yost, Blake McIver Ewing, and Aaron Carter was not a series of isolated, unfortunate accidents. They were the direct, inevitable results of a highly calibrated industrial process. The studio system of the 1990s and early 2000s required raw materials to build its empires. It needed the wide, innocent eyes of children to sell millions of plastic action figures, VHS tapes, and concert tickets. But the machine had zero tolerance for the complex, messy, and vulnerable reality of the human beings trapped inside those profitable images. When David Yost's sexuality threatened the hyper-masculine, marketable illusion of the Power Rangers, the crew did not just fire him. They subjected him to months of psychological waterboarding on the soundstage, driving him into the sterile, windowless rooms of a conversion therapy camp, where his nervous system was systematically dismantled until he was staring blankly at the ceiling of a Mexican psychiatric ward. When Blake McIver Ewing aged out of his cute, prepubescent Little Rascals persona and refused to hide his attraction to men, the casting directors did not offer him a graceful exit. They silently crossed his name off their clipboards, starved him of his only source of income, and backed him into a corner so tight that he had to strip down to a thong and grind his bare skin against a brass pole in a humid nightclub, picking up crumpled dollar bills from a sticky floor just to avoid sleeping on the concrete pavements of Los Angeles. When Aaron Carter's usefulness as a perfectly packaged, blonde-haired cash machine expired, his own bloodline, the family that had built mansions off his exhausted vocal cords, publicly discarded him. When he dared to come out as bisexual, seeking a shred of human connection, the public mocked him, and his brother filed restraining orders for the cameras. They locked the gates, leaving him completely isolated in a dark house, sucking toxic refrigerant gas into his lungs until his heart simply stopped beating under cold bathwater. Today, the entertainment industry operates under a heavily manufactured veneer of inclusivity. During the month of June, The corporate logos of the major television networks and record labels seamlessly transition into vibrant rainbows. Network executives pin enamel pride flags to the lapels of their $5,000 suits. They issue carefully drafted press releases celebrating diversity, equity, and the freedom to love. But the physical merchandise from the 1990s still exists. Somewhere, buried in the damp dirt of a suburban sandbox, is a plastic Blue Ranger action figure. In a cardboard box in a dark basement, a Full House DVD gathers dust. In the bargain bin of a 3-year FT store, a scratched Aaron Carter CD sits under a fluorescent light. These objects are indestructible. They will sit in landfills for centuries. They are the perfect, pristine products that the machine intended to create. The plastic never ages, the digital smiles never fade, and the recorded voices never crack. The human bodies that generated them, however, were fragile. They bled. They starved. They suffocated. The machine demanded perfection, and when it discovered that these boys possessed an identity it could not neatly package and sell to conservative advertisers, it did not attempt to fix the system. It simply crushed the boys. It took their youth, harvested the profits, deposited the checks, and threw the empty husks into padded rooms, dive bars, and morgues. They spent their entire childhoods standing under blinding studio lights, selling the concepts of unbreakable friendship, family values, and pure joy to millions of children around the globe. Yet when the cameras turned off, there was no one left in the dark to save them. The stage has been swept. The blood has been bleached from the floorboards. The machine is fully operational. The cameras are rolling, and the casting call for the next batch of angels begins tomorrow morning. The machine relies on our collective amnesia to keep the gears turning. Do not let these stories be permanently erased. Drop your thoughts in the comments below on who you believe the industry failed the most, and subscribe to the channel as we continue to tear down the pristine illusions of Hollywood's darkest histories. The next investigation is already waiting in the dark.